All right, GM everyone. I am thrilled to be able to introduce you all today to our one of our two Ed Talks at this time. This is Dr. Josh Rosenthal, who is of Narwhal Capital, and he has brought into the space a super nuanced approach and discussion points to Web3 and crypto. And as a historian, a history teacher by trade, I'm super, super excited for this conversation. And so without any further ado, I'll kick it over to you, Josh. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Oh, fantastic. Thanks for having me. It's quite a time to be doing this talk. So we'll try to make it interesting and worthwhile for everyone. And essentially what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk a little bit about history, history of crypto, not just today, not just recent events, not just, the past few years, but over the course of 1,000 years, basically. And then I'm going to, kind of retrace some ideas for how we might think about what's going on. And then we'll, particularly with an eye towards education. So I'll go over some material I've done elsewhere, but kind of set the stage. And then we'll go into education specifically, how to kind of think about it. And again, just for context, my background is earned PhD in late medieval Renaissance history with classics, know and read about 10 languages, spent about 10 years, reading through archival documents and old esoteric languages with various notes and notations on it. Then built a couple of Web2 companies, successfully sold those, and then went into running the technology and crypto and investing from 17 on. And so I'm going to speak as a student, as an educator, at least at one point, and then also as someone who participates in it. And so today's talk, which I'm going to do something you're never supposed to do, which is just read stuff, but I'm going to read you the thesis up front because I know this is a very high-powered intellectual crowd, so I'm going to go through things pretty quickly. So I want to make sure that everybody has a thesis in mind. And so I'm going to be talking about this idea of a crypto renaissance for education, and specifically Web3 as a recreation ad fontes going back to the sources. And the thesis which we'll go through is that crypto is something we've seen before, and it's a show we've seen, and it's absolutely epic. The last Renaissance communities recreated their world. They transformed this hierarchical, institutionally laden medieval world into the modern world that we know today, particularly with education, schools, universities, all that sort of thing. Everyday people set up wallets for double entry bookkeeping and created this idea of proto capitalism, entrepreneurship. And they smashed the like button on the printing press and shared these revolutionary ideas that the world could be something otherwise than they had seen, a different possible world. They also generated a market for media and learning at scale. And early adopters didn't buy their way into the culture. They used this weird looking techno-art to redefine what was valuable, what had meaning in the universe, and what was the nature of work, learning, and reality. And so history doesn't necessarily repeat itself, but it definitely rhymes. Their ledger-based finance is our cryptocurrencies, their printing press, our Web3, and we're early, and this gut-wrenching volatility isn't a leading indicator of demise. Historically, it's a leading indicator that it's structural transformation, that change matters. And these changes tend to follow a pattern, or at least, in the first instance, it's finance, then there's art and identity, then you move into work, and then education, and ultimately create and recreate new worlds, meta and IRL, as kids say today. Change is really slow, and then it's done. And so for education, it means learning out loud about how to use the new tools, interacting with new communities and their improvement initiatives as curriculum, and learning how to bet on oneself and one's students in this new economic model. And the last Renaissance communities embraced a new type of social coordination to recreate the nature of learning itself. Rarely do you get a chance to do the same, and it is an epic opportunity, not just despite the volatility, but because of it. So let's make the most of it. So with that said, I'm going to just quickly flip through this idea, flesh it out a little bit, and then we'll get into the educational pieces around it. And so usually here I tell a little joke or talk about what it was like to live through an apocalypse. When we say Renaissance, that means rebirth or recreation of society. And that sounds nifty, and we think about Michelangelo or cute, fat little angels and think that seems like really interesting and say, wouldn't it have been great to live during this massively, transformational period? I would have marched out boldly and taken advantage of it. But for people at the time, it didn't feel like that. It was incredibly volatile. They were punched in the gut repeatedly. When they woke up, chilled in the middle of the night in a cold sweat. This is Albert Dürer, one of the Renaissance artists, in his apocalyptic dream. He thought the heavens were raining, fire, wiping everything out. And literally they thought their world was ending, and they weren't wrong. As war, plague, famine, and death were unleashed, and they're riding high, and they're coming for you. Global war, plague after plague, creating supply chain problems and famine. Their money was worth something and then not worth anything. And it caused them to question all of their reality. It's an odd historical fact that the people that are in the midst of the greatest transitions are the least likely to appreciate it after the fact. And so one of the things we're going to do is look at some of this volatility and say, hey, is this a sign that the world is actually ending, or is it actually being recreated? So that's basically the idea behind, and this is Drer's Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse. And so in order to get a sense of what that was really like, I need you to suspend disbelief, and I'm going to introduce you to, your medieval twin. I'm going to ask you to pretend you're in a possible world and think about what it was like for you on the eve of a massive transformation, to experience it. And it's very easy to kind of make fun of, medieval you for not knowing what was going on. But one of the things I'm going to do is quickly sketch out how it might be very similar dynamics today. And so we might want to go easy on medieval you, and hopefully historians in the future will go easy on us. And so medieval you, just in a nutshell, your world was permissioned, it was hierarchical, you couldn't read, you couldn't write, you didn't have access to sustainable capital, you're an agricultural laborer, you'd never been more than a few miles away from where you lived, and you're at the bottom of a pyramid, and the idea of doing something other never would have occurred to you, permissioned to the core. And so if you look at some of the art, and I realize I'm mixing medieval and Renaissance, but these images of pyramids are all over the place, and the perspective is important. You're always at the bottom. And so their world, religion wasn't just the content of private belief, it was a structure of their reality: power, military force, money, social contracts, ties of fidelity and obligation. And there was something cosmic, then there were layers of institutional individuals, whether it was church or state, if you want to use those words, and then you at the very, very bottom looking up. Your agency was completely was minimal, to put it that way. And when historians, and a lot of my work's around complex systems from an interdisciplinary think tank in Paris, we tend to pull on different threads, and the threads I like to pull on are value and community and identity. And so for medieval you, value was locked, capital was in land and buildings, which sounds kind of crazy, except most people have their money and their houses today, right? There wasn't really coin. There was a little bit, but it wasn't for you, and you couldn't spend it. There are things called sumptuary laws, and so you couldn't spend your money as you saw. Communication was definitely limited. Not only could you not read and write, but producing a document was incredibly expensive. A year's salary, 10 years salary are impossible depending upon how you were. And you had to go to a place to have someone who had that knowledge to be able to create those documents. Those documents were power and control. They're geographically proxied in an archive, and you didn't have access to them. There's some oral tradition and things like that, but anytime anything bubbled up from the bottom, it was quickly and swiftly put down in its place. And these two things fused to form your identity. Your stars were fixed. You're likely a farmer, your parents were a farmer, their parents, their parents, their parents, their parents, their parents, their parents, and about 4 more sets of those. You were stuck. And that the kicker behind it is that it wouldn't have occurred to you, to medieval you, that you were permissioned, that your world was permissioned. It was like the air you breathed. You never would have noticed it. And that sounds really silly until you look, now. I hope that historians will be kinder to us when we look back. So if we pull on these same threads and say, I view history as swinging back and forth between aggregation and distribution and decentralization. I think we're in a period of very fundamental aggregation again, and we're just starting to unwind, which is why you see this volatility. And so if we pull on these same threads, just like medieval you, we're in similar spots, and likewise, we're not aware of it. So value, you control your money, maybe, not just on centralized exchanges, but do you really do you really own your money? If you use a trading app, you own a medieval IOU. You can't control your money. It's worth less and less, and you're not quite sure how much less it's worth at any given point in time. You think you can spend it, but maybe not. If you say the wrong thing on Twitter, PayPal freezes your account. I tried to attend a crypto conference recently, and the credit card company said, we know it's not fraudulent. We just don't want to run the payment on our rails because we don't like the content. And so we're much more permissioned than we tend to think. Communication is fairly obvious. We think about deplatforming all the time. But worse than that, they might do something and they might let you keep talking. Like a medieval lord, they might harvest your time and attention and transmute it alchemaically through magic into profit for them. You see a small window through this Web2 stack, and that window is optimized for their profitability. And so even if you think you communicate, you might not be communicating in a way that you have control over. And finally, identity. If you don't own your identity, this is kind of walking back a false fork, in the sense that when we first started doing digitization, we didn't have computational power to persist identity. And so we essentially outsourced our identity, our logging in to different FANG, Facebook, Amazon, Microsoft companies that persisted our identity for us. And so these things are much more static than we tend to think about. If you lose your account, you're kind of done. What are you going to do? You don't control your identity off chain anywhere. And so essentially, like the trade that was made, and they express themselves in different types of art. And I realize this is offensive and crazy. This is Martin Luther, and he's making a comment in this woodcut, this copper etching or woodcut that really was printing at its core. When we think of printing and the advent of literacy, we think everybody sat down in school and learned to read, but that wasn't the case. The technology actually created the literacy. The technology created the market for media, and it created the market for learning, which was wild. And this is the first time you've really seen art, and the art was wild and had different sorts of versions of reality embedded. Instead of saying your hierarchical reality was the only reality that you could persist in, this image basically said, hey, that hierarchical authority, it's actually illegitimate. The authority figures themselves are birthed in the bowels of hell. This is Birth of the Curia, Martin Luther and Lucas Cranach. And there's a Medusa figure, and she's suckling a little guy there, and they're kind of pooping out their adversaries, which is hilariously fun. It's like shit posting way back in the day. But the point of the story is that these authority figures were illegitimate, and it's not that they created chaos. It's that they were actually soothing in the midst of volatility and this apocalyptic dream of recreating society. It was a far safer bet to go back into the security, the demonic lullaby of people, playing a sweet tune that everyone, went fleeing back to. And so that was Luther's point. And if we're honest, we might be tempted to make the same sort of trade. The good news is that it actually doesn't matter. If the technology has an endemic or a creative, a Genesis laden for a Renaissance laden approach. And so what happened? How did we get out of it last time? Well, if we pull on these same threads, all of a sudden with value, there's an advent or a rediscovery of something called ledger-based financial accounting. This is double entry bookkeeping. Yeah, the scholars will say it had been around, suppressed, North African communities, what have you, but this little family in the middle of nowhere, you hadn't heard of them. They're in the south of France, called the Medici. One of their clerks discovered it, and bam, all of a sudden they took the papal seat in the throne of France in one generation because they're early adopters. It was very volatile, but the idea was you didn't need to centralize your accounting. You didn't have to have a reconciliation. You could essentially do small loans. And so proto capitalism, as the historians call it, exploded. Loans, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of loans, and you could now leave your farm to go off and set up your shop and essentially recreate or create a new world for yourself. How would that idea have occurred to you? Well, this communication protocol, which was decentralized, occurred at the same time. It was called print. We think of Gutenberg Bible or Luther's Theses. That wasn't what you typically read. You read a big broadsheet. It was a Flugschriften. It was a giant thing with a copper etching, which had these crazy images on it and a fat tagline. And even if you couldn't read, someone around you might kind of be able to. And so you read it as a communal performative event. And it said the reality that you're experiencing isn't the only option. There's another thing you could do, not only because these authorities are illegitimate, but also there is a body of information which you have access to. The idea of starting a shop was expressed through this material, as well as the manuals how to do that, how to actually keep your own ledger, keep your own accounts. Even if you weren't literate, you could kind of scratch it out. And then finally, identity. This art I've talked about it's not just the technology was laden with the new values. And so basically the art wasn't just a form of identity or rallying people to a cause. It was actually created from the new technology itself. And that was wild. Not just the content of what they expressed, but the idea that anything other after hundreds of years of stasis was possible. And so the art actually had a generative function, and your first experience with art and a reformation of identity came through a medium which was technological and endemic. For the Web2 folks, this is all media is the message, and Marshall McLuhan and those guys, you can kind of dig into it. And so what they did wasn't buy their way into society through, gross, kind of Machiavellian purchasing power. They actually recreated what was important. So if you're a traditional historian and you're doing an art class, you see like Lucas Cranach the Elder, and he's a very well-known Renaissance artist. This is Melancholia, pinnacle of form and function. And this is how you may know them. And they often put them and their buddies and their paintings. This is kind of my homage to them where I'm there. This is what you would have seen. This is the same guy, and he's the guy doing these woodcuts, and he's shitposting essentially. They're pulling down their pants and they're lighting their farts to explode these documents I've been talking about of illegitimate authority. And so what does all of that mean? That means that they used this new technology and they had decentralized finance. They accounted for their own ledgers. They had new ideas, revolutionary, a decentralized printing press, which authorities couldn't tamp down. They tried to, essentially KYC the printers, but then it tended not to work out very well. So you could ignore the technology. You could lean into the FUD, which worked for periods until it didn't, or you could embrace the technology and participate in it, thereby legitimizing it. And that essentially was the recreation of capitalism, the recreation of social structure. Back at that other slide, what happened was it split communities. And so now you had the advent of pluralism, not just democracy and representative pluralism, but a variety of people choosing the other, forcing the issue of coexistence technologically and socio-demographically as well. So what does all this mean? It's a nice story. This means that we see these renaissances and rebirths when not great men have great ideas, not when there's a fight over capital, but usually communities make history by using technologies which are specifically decentralized. Last time it was ledger and printing press. This time is cryptocurrencies and Web3. And when they do this, it tends to follow an arc. This isn't teleological. It's not deterministic. It's just a playbook of how things tend to work out. It starts with finance because that's where there's the most value. Then it moves into culture. And so this is how communities organize and express themselves. And then into work, new formulations. Last time it was a corporation following this playbook. And then finally into education, which I'll talk about in a second, where you have proof of experience and expertise, and this disintermediates some of these institutions. And then finally into IRL, into different worlds, which sounds kind of crazy. When we think of metaverse, we often pit that against IRL, but you'd never read before. And so the first time you're reading, you're going into a book and you're transporting your attention, you lose track of where you are, you're somewhere else. And that other place is real. You acquire information, you bring it back to this real world, and now you've left the farm, you're opening up a shop, and you know how to run a ledger. That was like magic to them, basically, right? It was like rediscovering the zero. And so these two things, the synthetic world through media and virtue digitization in this case, and the real world work to form a virtuous cycle. And so that's, if history rhymes, something we might see. And we're already seeing that in crypto with proof of geographic, proof of geography, proof of physical work, things like that are what I would predict is going to be very big in the next wave. And so for folks interested, here's slides with 9.5 theses where you can drill into the stuff if you're interested in this. This is my homage to Luther's 95 Theses. There's a bit of a bibliography for folks who like to read. This is some of the stuff I'd use lecturing at Harvard or swanky places like this. It's a bit of science fiction, which is worth thinking about, and then some philosophy. If you believe this thesis that crypto is a recreation of society, then it takes an interdisciplinary lens to really get a sense of what's possible. And a lot of the critique from McLuhan to Baudrillard and Jourdan and those guys are really critiquing the image being more real than the thing itself, is critiquing this false fork of us creating digitization without ownership. And so now we're walking back through that false fork. So, and definitions, some basic things for family and friends, and then some context if you're interested in following this in different languages, et cetera, et cetera. So what does this have to do with education specifically? And here's a picture of one of the manuals on how to do double entry bookkeeping, and this guy named Duns Scotus who wore this funny hat, who was the pinnacle of education at an institution which was proxied. You couldn't get into it. Medieval you wasn't allowed into this institution. You weren't able to read, you weren't able to write, and you didn't have permission or credentials to get in there in the first place. That that cap that he wore actually became the dunce cap and is a subject of ridicule, which tends to happen as you swing back through, from education, from pinnacle of enlightenment to looking at kind of decentralized education, which came as a result of this recreation of society. These are the grades that we have, the focus out of the Renaissance and emphasis on literacy, et cetera, et cetera. So for education specifically, if you're asking for action items, if all this plays out, that's interesting theory. What does it mean you should do about it? What are the takeaways? I'd say you might want to think about this for yourself as well as your students. There's kind of three things. One is doing the basic tech. That basically means the wallets, learning how to use the wallets and the messaging inside them, learning how to control your own keys and work with that. It's kind of a basic. The second is analyzing the community initiatives. As people get together and they create value, they're educating one another, and they're actually working this out in real time. The difference is this has never been visible before in a meaningful way. As an institutional investor, I can tell you everything we're seeing in public right now has been happening all the time behind the scenes. It just hasn't been in public before. And the amazing thing about doing this in public is all those records aren't only on chain, they're available, whether it's a EIP or an HIP, these improvement initiatives, which ones pass, which ones fail, what did they have intended consequences or unintended consequences. Those are all, HBS or Harvard Business School case studies to be made, and you can literally reuse them as the content of your curriculum, which is insane. You never had visibility to that before. And then finally, 3, this idea of learning to read the new data. And I don't just mean Dune or Masari, that's definitely good to do, but as we've seen, there's limits to what can actually be seen around that. I mean, looking at the markets and their reaction, everyday individuals, people at this conference, people on Twitter, what is their reaction? And do you bet with it or do you bet against it? In early days when Twitter was failing and you saw that fail wall, did you buy more Twitter stock or did you sell? And this kind of gets down to the idea of, generally speaking, there's 2 ways to beat a market. It's to be in big and something early, or it's to bet against it. And historically, retail hasn't had visibility into community and content and code, all of which is visible now. You're seeing early stage technology, you're seeing Google in its garage, right? Where the community is actually more important than the code. If Web 2, the value is in the code, like now, could you imagine forking Google's code base? I, as a successful startup founder, it scares the snot out of me thinking one of my startups would have had a stock price from day one. And so you have access to all of these pieces. So you need to learn to read the data and learn to make the interpretation on it, which is all out there, more than any VC had ever dreamed about. If you believe that education is a function of producing, kind of a classical global citizen, then interacting with this technology, which is a gateway to not just improvement initiatives, but the things around that, that's the new data and social coordination. That's the function of all of these loci of education. And then what do you want to do with it? If you believe that education is a function to recreate your world and do something which has an economic basis or follows this 5 spheres, then learning how to make the best for yourself and your students is incredibly important. And you can do that synthetically, or you can just go back historically and say, given what we knew at the time, what would we do differently? So based on that, what's likely to happen if I had to put on a crystal, look in a crystal ball or put on a hat, if history does rhyme, I think there's going to be 3 big buckets, and these will be opportunities for you and students. The first will be praxis. Is Web3 education about using Web3 in education, or is it learning about it? I think that's kind of a false dichotomy. There will be a renewed emphasis on praxis, learning to use the tech as tools for learning, not for its own sake, but for what it can do, what it can lock. So almost ignore the technology and imagine if you had access into community and code and content and stock price, if you knew what was going to be valuable, how people were going to coordinate to achieve that value, whether value is defined economically, unlocking other knowledge, or working together towards, towards social goals, traditionally 501c3, having access to those tools and getting really good at it, knowing what button to push and how to push it, seems very, droll, but is incredibly important. The second is entrepreneurship. What we saw at the unwinding of the Middle Ages into the recreation of the Renaissance was that it was powered by capitalism, or proto-capitalism, entrepreneurship. I don't mean capitalism in a hyper-concentrated pejorative way. I mean the ability for you to change your stars, to leave your farm, to set up your shop, and to work for yourself without anyone's permission. It essentially made everyone an entrepreneur. Even if you didn't take advantage of it, you had optionality to do that. And we're seeing the same thing again today. You can participate in ownership of these things you're using, the protocols powering the conference today, without even purchasing them. You can earn ownership in entities by using the product itself, turning your cost center into a revenue generator, which is wild. In that sense, everyone's an investor. If it's in your time or your attention, your data is incredibly important. You give it away or pay $9 a month for a subscription service. That's what powers hundreds of millions of dollars monthly on Web2 companies. That data you now have ability to monetize for yourself if you choose to, as well as, even if you're not monetizing it directly, your own time and attention is incredibly valuable in terms of where you want to focus. And so you're now an investor in yourself and your students. You have access to early stage technology that was never seen before, never even imaginable for the most elite upper decile, venture capitalists. Access into the code itself, you can fork it if you like to. Access into the community, what's a sentiment? Is there development on this? Not just STEM and technical coding, but on the ideas and humanities, social sciences around it. And price, does it have economic viability to be meaningful? Or is it just, a recipient of neo 501c3s? And then finally, number 3, this idea of vocation. This came out of the Renaissance and Reformation. And previously, the important stuff was outside the world. It was being in a monastery and locked away from it. And Luther and company basically said, no, the meaningful stuff is working in society with your family and your friends and your community, helping yourself and helping others. And you saw the locus of art change. Instead of it just being the sacred, it turned into the profane or the common, hence the ubiquitous fruit bowl. And so the meaningful stuff is doing something that you like to do and you're good at. In that sense, we're all Victorians, where we have these different rooms. This is my day job, which is horrible. This is my hobbies and interests. And then here's my activities and my causes and my 501c3s over here. The idea of vocation is that, and neo-capitalism or proto-capitalism recreated, is that you can find what you like and are good at and do that as a living. Now, historically, that was very difficult to do in Web 2 because the distribution curve created TAM and aggregation, meaning you needed to have an audience of millions to make it viable. Now we're seeing an audience of thousands, or an audience even 100, as you pull the equity and the financing out of that distributed curve and put it into these esoteric interests. All of a sudden, esoteric interests are incredibly viable, and there's nothing like academia or your own particular interest. The more esoteric, the more valuable. Niche actually has an economic function. So those would be three big areas of opportunities I see as being incredibly important, and those aren't going away with the latest C5 blow up. Those aren't going away anytime soon. This is a long arc. We're in the very early innings of this. We've had digitalization for 20, 30, 40 years, and we did that as a false fork without ownership. Only now do we have the technological capabilities to persist ownership, which gives us this economic viability for all this stuff we've been talking about. So we're essentially walking back this false fork. And so, boiling everything down to long story short, if you can only do a couple of things in terms of learning a skill for yourself, if you can only teach your students one single thing, and I'm saying this as not just an academic and Fulbright scholar, I'm saying this not just as a successful Web 2 entrepreneur, Ernst & Young Entrepreneur of the Year, selling to publicly traded companies, or a successful investor even today in this market. I'm telling you, just as a human being, the single thing you can do to help yourself and your students is teach them to stomach volatility. If you're not getting punched in the gut, someone else is doing that for you on your behalf and arbitraging the difference. Like, you have to be able to get back up off the mat. I'm not smart. I'm not even lucky. The only thing I've been able to do is to get back off the mat, to stomach humiliation, to stomach people piling on you, to see that actually as a sign that you might want to bet against the market. And speaking of betting, if that idea of an unlocking of educational firepower, where that literally means that you can make a living doing what you like in a viable way, so you're not the bottom as an educator of the economic pyramid, but you can actually make a reasonable living, it means that you might want to really learn how to bet, how to capitalize on that, and definitely how to teach your students how to do that. Which leads us to the third point. The single thing is being able to get up off the mat repeatedly, and then learning where it's smart to focus your time and attention, how to bet on yourself and your students, how to use those mechanisms. And that may mean disrupting yourself. This is classic, innovators' dilemma, right? Educational institutions are a function of kind of medieval aggregation, where you had to go to a certain place and you work in this factory model to achieve certain goals, because the locus of knowledge was cloistered and the smart stuff was in here and the dumb stuff was out there. In that sense, universities were the apex capitalists, where they're able to trick people into working for little money but for prestige, and they're able to parlay away nonprofit status, which is why you see a number of Ivy League educators run by with university presidents who are former hedge fund managers. And so that model itself might be ripe for disaggregation if history provides any sort of guide. That's very difficult for people to do, to disaggregate your own model, and only as well as your own institution, but it's something to seriously consider. And I predict you'll not only have a splitting or a forking of educational models, and I don't just mean into trade schools and things like that. I mean a decentralized model where institutions will, if they exist, they'll exist in a radically different format. And so you have all the visibility in terms of code and content and community. And so go and make the most of this moment. I'll leave you with this, the same guy, Martin Luther, this idea of this apocalyptic reign. That happens anytime you're remaking society. Volatility isn't, a death knell. Volatility is actually a sign that there's something structurally and transformative going on. When societies and complex ecosystems die, they do so quietly and smoothly. Nobody even notices. And so this idea of massive volatility is marked and meaningful. And I view this as a leading indicator that something important is going on. This is what you would have experienced during the last Renaissance. And this is what we're fortunate enough to be experiencing today. All that rhetoric of remaking the world, that's real. and this is the price to pay to do that. And so here's Martin Luther saying, hey, even if I knew the world would end tomorrow, I would still do my work. I would still plant my apple tree today. And so, yeah, it's absolutely raining outside. It's a winter. It's crazy and chaotic. Hats off to you for being here. Hats off for you to betting on yourself and your students by, acquiring this knowledge and even listening to this silly little talk today. And I'm always available on Twitter to chat. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much for sharing all those insights with us. I really appreciated from a very high level historically how these trends have played out, but more importantly, from a very practical perspective, like what you can do as an individual, and then more importantly, you even tied it into education too. And a couple of key takeaways that I have from that is, you talked about grit is a big thing, and we've been talking a lot about that in education, and hopefully doubling down on that in our classrooms and in our schools, and then also agency too, helping empower our young people to become self-sovereign and to be able to own their learning, own their pathways to learning, and then be able to do something that they like. I think everyone wants to be happy with the choices they make, and while we may take some wrong turns here and there, doing what you love is really, really important, and becoming increasingly possible because of the tools that we have at our disposal. And so much appreciated the way that you kind of pulled that all together, again, from a very high level to a very practical perspective. And I hope everyone today, and I'm sure everyone today, found that equally as impressive. So thank you so much for your time and for sharing all your expertise.
No, thanks for having me. And I'll hop in the little platform right now. So really appreciate it. We'll talk to you soon.
Awesome. Thanks.